I'm going to ask Jason to read this aloud and explain to me word by word what the hell he's saying.
Yes. I was going to joke when people got here that, you know, this is easily the most straightforward part we've read, right? So everybody just completely understands it and we can go straight to the conversation, right?
Well, this is all Heidegger now. We're learning about Nietzsche in it, but it's basically all Heidegger. He's no longer exposing Nietzsche's presentation of the idea.
Pretty much. He wants to put everything he said about Nietzsche and what he said about what he learned about metaphysics, thinking about Nietzsche, into how it looks from the standpoint of his own understanding of things.
Yeah, and now I realize I really need to go back and methodically go through Being and Time.
Yep. Yep. And you'll never have to do that again, right? Because after you've read it the second time, you know, it's just all there, right?
It becomes as natural to be in a worldview as Plato's view has.
I'm joking with you, right?
I know you're laughing, but what he was saying earlier about the eons, I mean, the progression through history of our time, at least from the metaphysical, from the view of what being is, how it determines how people think about being. And you correctly at one point pointed out when Heidegger was actually speaking that it's Heidegger projecting sort of a phenomenological interpretation into these things. Being a student of Husserl, it wouldn't surprise me. But that really clarified, because I can see that in the ontological world that Heidegger's describing, to say table on the one hand, in the more abstract sense, exists, so it's real and exists. And you can also say that the table in front of me that has the odd color and shape also exists as a being. So the distinction between being, lowercase b, and being, uppercase b, is not as clear as it might be in the German.
It's not clear in the German either. It's very much Heidegger himself, and he's famously obscure even to natural German speakers. There are places where the translation makes it harder, and we'll talk about one of those. That my favorite one in this case is when the translator has to brainstorm that he wants to use default to translate the staying away of being. I think that there's all kinds of resonances that would have remained there and been more obvious if he had left that much closer to the literal, but he decided that he had a poetic brainstorm of how he was going to make it clearer to people, and he introduced this jarring word default.
What is the German word for it? I mean, what did Heidegger write?
It's Ausbelieben.
Right. Okay, I sort of understand that.
Which is sort of like outdwelling.
Yeah.
Staying away is the literal meaning, but it has the interior form of it's a preface meaning out or outside in front of the word for staying, but it's also close to the word for shelter.
Much more clear.
So
than default.
Staying away, staying outside is the staying out is sort of the more literal German. And after he translates it that way for a couple of paragraphs, and he gives you a little footnote and tells you he's about to do it. He says, now I'm going to start translating this as default. And then for the whole rest of the essay, he just writes the word default. Then you have to retranslate it back into the thing he's mistranslated it from everywhere. So it makes it easily 40% harder to read the remaining 2/3 of the essay, or 3/4 of the essay even, because he does it fairly early. But yeah, there are places where the translation does make it harder, but it's not easy in the German either. And if there's one fundamental thing I'd say, it's that if you can see the distinction he's discussing, and you're using your intellectual intuition to examine the matter itself as opposed to the words he's saying about it, you can follow what he's saying, and there'll be places where he's making claims that he hasn't substantiated yet, and others where he's expecting you to follow, looking at the, if I can put it this way, the phenomenal evidence of the thing itself, right? And the latter is quite common, but it's very hard in the sense that if you don't know the different technical ways in which he's using the terms, you can easily just get the impression that it's one new usage after another that he's expecting you to just grab by osmosis or something, and it doesn't seem tightly enough argued to follow. And he sustains that at an extreme level of, well, abstraction isn't quite the right word, but something like abstraction, or at least mystical contact with the phenomena he's discussing, if you could put it that way.
Did you start the recording already?
I did. When you started the substantive questions, I decided not to wait for other people and started the recording. Welcome, Brian. I don't know if we're getting two more. There's one other person signed up, and Jim may come. I sent Jim a note, but I think he also may have had a bed last night, so I'm not sure if he's going to make it. But anyway, the fundamental point is that this is easily the hardest material in, not since being in time, but in this book, in the sense that you have the least to grab onto that's from the earlier metaphysical ways of thinking of philosophers you might be more familiar with, that it may seem less alien than Heidegger. That being said, this is also the place where the more Heidegger you have, the more you can follow what he's doing. But there's no question it's challenging. The single most important one, which we will definitely have to talk to, is he talks about being, capital B, and the being. And he doesn't say beings here when he means the being. When he says the being, sometimes it means something like the world, but more normally it means the subject matter of metaphysics, which is kind of like an unspecified random abstraction being. It is being qua being. So imagine that metaphysics is talking about something where there's an upside down A in front of all of its claims about things. It wants to tell you something which is true for every being. So it's got a for every being, insofar as it is a being, given to me as a being, I notice X, Y, Z. And metaphysics is doing that because it wants to find invariance. And it wants to find invariance because it wants to grasp what is stable, general, common across beings as such. And that means that it is always talking about the being, by which it means some given being, some hypothetical being, a random being that occurs under a hidden for every sign, right? And what Heidegger is pointing out is that that operation of the for every makes perfect sense for essences, but not for existences. For existences, for the individual particular that is, and the fact that it is, the for every is hiding something. Another way of putting this is he wants there to be an active verbal sense of being. Being is something which happens, which transpires. The being commits the event of existing over the next second, right? And this is not just something that each being does. It is also something that happens tout court, il y a being, right? It is always already happening, and not about a particular given being, but about existence as such, which is exactly what he's saying metaphysics is not thinking. And he's saying it's not thinking that because it's not thinking about, I'll put it this way, the actuality of the actual and the things that are, because it's got everything bracketed inside a for every being insofar as it is given. Because it is trying to talk about a for every being insofar as it is given, it's taken the givenness of the given things for granted without discussing or noticing it. And that means the one thing that it's going to miss is something like the actuality of the particular real, right? The actuality of the particular thing, that it is in time, that it presences force, that its essence perdures. All of those active verbal senses of to be in time are going to tend to be missed, or they're only going to be noticed as something which lots of beings have in common. But to Heidegger, being in this sense is a history that happens once to everything. It's not a being that happens hypothetically to 40 different things over which we have a for every sign, which are each abstractions out of that history. It's that history itself of the whole universe, right? There is one actual time in which everything actual actually acts. And that is exactly what metaphysics doesn't look at, right? Metaphysics has already factored the one time in which everything happens as a unity into the many different particular things in front of which you can put a for every sign and about which you can think in terms of classes and universals, right? But there is also just actuality, pure. Not actuality as something which one or another being might have, but the capital A actuality of the one thing that actually transpires, right? Being in that sense is something which everything actual does in a way that is way more emphatic than the being of the individual particular taken as hypothetical. The table in front of you that you're looking at is not an abstract table. The table in front of you you're looking at is not an example out of a metaphysical or philosophical discussion. It's a material particular in time, which is doing is right in front of you. And philosophers reason metaphysically, he says, they of course they know that actuality happens. They use it for data to adjudicate their claims about the essences. They want to reason about the general case, and the only reason they consult actuality is to verify or refute the universality of some claim about how all of them are as a class, which is exactly not looking at the individual happening instance. Now, why does this matter for the stuff we're talking about? Because metaphysics has a history. It doesn't have 6 histories. It doesn't have 48 histories. It has a history. There is a one something that actually transpired, right? And thinking occurs within that history as the actual thoughts of actual thinkers responding to arguments before, whatever, and making decisions in this fateful, forward-directed, forming the potential of what happens next way. And all of that acting in history stuff that metaphysics as an activity actually does, Heidegger is claiming, is hidden from metaphysics because it doesn't have that sense of the one actuality of the stream of time in which the thoughts that it is thinking occur. It's not concrete enough. It's not phenomenological enough. It is not ferociously individualist enough to see that all of its thoughts are, individual acts in the stream of time. It's always putting a class for every function generalization in front of everything, right? And maybe that's because Plato decided for it that essentiality is or essences are the stable thinkable thing that thought tries to deal in terms of. Or maybe because it's running to the permanent from human finitude. But whatever the historical or psychological or motivational reasons for it, there's a single particular thing that all of it tends to be missing, which is it's always looking at being as something which is the subject of a generalization and not as something that the actual does, right? It's an essential attribute of a generalization for metaphysics, not a act of existence, that the existing as such, or that actuality as such, does. So he's trying to point to that happening, that sort of ongoing happening sense of being. There's a German word which is particularly freighted for this, which is Wesen, W-E-S-E-N, right? And this is the usual way in which people translate into German the term essence from Latin. But it also means something like essential unfolding or ongoing occurrence. It has a verbal form. Wesen is what the thing does when it is. It's not just the abstract essence off in the mathematical realm of the ideal of the mathematical triangle, right? It's also what the table that is in front of you and isn't a metaphorical or an example table does. It tables. It tables along from one second to the next, doing table into the world, right? So that table is, right? That's a sense in the German word Wesen, right? Essential unfolding, the essence imprinting itself on the actual of time, something like that. So in the whole first third of this essay, where he's talking about what are the limitations of metaphysics, and he's talking about what is unthought in metaphysics, he's continually using these very abstract formulas that being is unthought in metaphysics, and it thinks only about the being of the being. What is he, this is extremely obscure. One has a capital B, they're the same word, one has a the in front of it and a lowercase, what the hell, right? But you have to read that the being as meaning the being that occurs inside a for every sign, about which metaphysics wants to make essential universal predication. And that means it's something like a common abstraction across beings. It is derived from beings as an abstracted out essence, which means that the one thing that it doesn't have, because the one thing that you leave behind when you abstract out an essence, is the individual, numerically identical actualization in time of each of the things, right? That they are. That's exactly what Heidegger says metaphysics takes as given, right? And metaphysics does understand being as prior to the beings, but it always wants to understand it as the prior that is already given. We start from any being given to us as an example of the thing to which we will apply our thought. And what gave it to us? Heidegger asks. What gave it to you is that it is an actual upon which you can orient yourself, that it already is. So from the standpoint of metaphysics, the thing which he is calling being is the actuality of all the particulars that it brings under its functions, right? As instantiation in time, something like that. So the instantiation in time aspect of being, or what the scholastics would have called actuality as opposed to reality, is what he's always noticing is downplayed or only understood of a hypothetical being in metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is still going to run into the issue of it then will need an explanation for the existence of the actual as such. And this is where the notion of ontotheology comes in this essay, right? His claim is that ontology tells you what each of the for every beings must be, and then theology tells you about the actuality of that for every. Metaphysics traces the actuality of its concepts to a first cause or highest essence, right? Or God, or concept, if you're Hegelian, right? And all of those are something which is in the same order of essentiality as the other things that metaphysics concerns itself with, but is regarded within the metaphysical schemes themselves as explaining, causing, made the a priori that is responsible for the existence of the actual, right? So, and he claims that that's an essential part of the structure of metaphysics, because the fact that you want to think essentially means after you've factored out every essence from every particular, all that you have left from each one of them is its actualization in time is. And those all concatenate back to a first cause. So it can be a first cause temporally, or it can be a first cause in the order of substructure to superstructure, subsistence and substance underneath it, whatever. But metaphysics will try to think about actuality in terms of individual beings that it is going to posit to itself as givens, right? In that sense, it projects a reified individual thing as performing the activity that Heidegger phenomenologically and naively just wants to call being. Now that does mean that from the standpoint of metaphysics, Heidegger looks like he's talking about something like a theology without a God. The previous God function has been taken over by an anonymous being. And that's not entirely misleading. But from Heidegger's standpoint, he's much more phenomenological, concrete than that. He thinks remarkably little is known about that ongoing activity, that being ongoing activity, but what can be characterized about it phenomenologically, he plans to characterize about it. Okay. Anyway, that's the single biggest easy thing to stumble on at the gate, so to speak, in the first 10 pages. Even if you don't stumble at that one at the gate, right? It is still a soaring essay, right, with a lot of hard bits. But if that one doesn't sink in, then a lot of the remainder is going to look like it's coming out of nowhere, because you won't have a reality to look at to verify his steps, so to speak. You'll just be taking them on trust or distrust, right? But you can't look for yourself and see, when he's saying that metaphysics does this, can I look at metaphysics and seeing it doing it? Or is the thing he's claiming about it so incomprehensible I can't even tell if it would apply to metaphysics or not, right? Or I have to take his word for it. Okay. We segued into all this before we got a chance to do any reactions, and there are some things I want to do to sort of set the stage. But before I start on reactions, just stage setting. The whole essay starts with a question, which is, the first paragraph is just noting the fact that Nietzsche has not already thought all the things that Heidegger thinks, right? Which is kind of setting the stage for the problem here is going to be one of translation in an intellectual sense of how, from the standpoint of Heidegger's thought, does Nietzsche's thought look, something like that. And then he sort of says, but it could easily look like we're doing this just to, blame Nietzsche for not having thought everything I thought, right? And he claims that that's not what he's trying to do, although it's at least part of what he's doing. But the question he immediately gets to either is, the reason I'm asking this is I want to know whether or not Nietzsche overcomes nihilism or not. Nietzsche makes the claim that he has diagnosed the problem of nihilism and found the way out of it. He has found the way to overcome nihilism. And Heidegger wants to raise the question, has Nietzsche found a way out of nihilism, or is he still mired in nihilism? And he obviously is going to come down on the side of he's still mired in nihilism, but not because nihilism is the same thing that Nietzsche understood by it, but because it's something else. Okay, so that's sort of the general motivation of the essay. The general motivation of the essay is Nietzsche and nihilism. Does he get out of it? Is he still in it? What is this nihilism thing such that Nietzsche can think that he got out of it, but is in fact still in it? And that means we're going to get these accelerating definitions of nihilism, if I can put it that way, right? You get one level definition of nihilism after another, each deeper, more involved than the last. And moving from the place where Nietzsche starts to the place where Heidegger ends. So that by the end of it, we're going to have a definition of nihilism that is how it actually looks to Heidegger's mature thought. And we're going to go through many levels to get there, 5 or something, right? Not 2. To arrive at how the same history that Nietzsche describes as nihilism, or the highest values devaluing themselves, looks to Heidegger, right? So that's the general subject matter of the essay is, what is the essence of nihilism to mature Heidegger? Along the way, we're going to get claims about nihilism and metaphysics. He's going to claim that it's not Nietzsche that's nihilistic, it's metaphysics that's nihilistic in one of the suitably accelerating advanced definitions of nihilism. And one question is just to ask whether that goes through, right? It's easier to see it in Nietzsche, as Heidegger himself will allow, than in all of metaphysics. And we have to ask, is his diagnosis of it being there in all of metaphysics accurate or not? But the next is just going to be, how does this nihilism understanding in Heidegger's mature view fit into his overall, if I put it this way, philosophical anthropology or topology of being or role of man, all of those things. Okay. And in the course of all that, he's going to give us a whole bunch of, he's going to give us a whole structure of his understanding of that later history that we haven't gotten before. That's, if I can put it this way, a radical rereading of the things which Nietzsche thinks he's diagnosing. Okay. The last thing that I'm going to mention is that having seen all of that, we're also going to have to assess it. Some of which we can save for next time. But we first face the problem of comprehension. We need to know what Heidegger is actually saying here about his own position before we can react to it. Okay, I want to mention one other thing about where that whole structure is going. There's a sense in which one of the things at stake in all this is something like a charge of impiety leveled at Nietzsche and maybe at metaphysics. But it's not impiety in the ontotheology sense. So there's also a charge of shallowness directed at previous theology or something like that. I just want to raise the issue here that there's a way in which the terrain of this essay is almost theological, right? Both in its criticisms of past metaphysical theology and in the, if I can put it this way, the faults that it is finding with past thinkers' response to being as to being and the claims of being, something like that, which amounts to something like an inattention bordering on impiety. Okay, so subtext. One of the most conventional senses in which Nietzsche is thought of as being a nihilistic thinker is he's an atheistic thinker, right? He is the thinker of the thought that God is dead. And Heidegger makes the claim in this essay that the statement that God is dead is a theological claim. And that yes, it's an inverted theology in Nietzsche, but it is still a theology. Okay, so anyway, all of that is just background of the terrain of this essay before we get to actual reactions. But reactions, your first reaction, Joe, that triggered me all off was you said, this was hard and you're gonna have to ask me questions about what the heck does he mean here and so forth, which is entirely fair. But other first reactions?
Well, I like very much what you've just laid out as the distinctions, because I possibly had missed that as a perspective in which to digest what I was reading. So my other reaction has been sort of like, they're talking about something that's sort of very high up there. When you could bring in what Plato was doing and what Descartes was doing, and then bring it up and show what Nietzsche is doing. That's really looking back and looking from a professorial standpoint, which is not surprising. That's what Heidegger was. And so I'm very pleased, but I'm still like the student that wandered into the class and says, did I enroll here? Wow, this is interesting. But
this class has more prerequisites than I knew about. Yes, so that it doesn't list this as a prerequisite on the syllabus. Yeah, no, I'm going to go a little bit further. All this stuff we've had before has had a whole lot of deep history of philosophy prerequisites. In this one, it's almost like, if you've got all the deep philosophical prerequisites, I also want to know, are you an original mystical thinker? Because otherwise you're not going to follow.
Original mystical thinker. Okay.
Are you an original?
What's the word?
Let me finish. An original mystical thinker. If you're not that trifecta, you're probably not going to follow me. Heidegger is basically saying.
Oh.
Right. I mean, he's
what does
talking.
he mean by the mystical part? Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's talking about what the actions of being are in the history of the West, and the way in which being stays away, and the way in which there is an essential pull from being on the mind of man as being withdrawals, and the way in which man responds or does not respond to that. And right, all of these are the kinds of things you would have found in Eckhart, or the Dark Night of the Soul, or whatever. You might find some references, some similarities to things you would find in Kierkegaard, but it's that register. It's not the register of a Tracton Wittgenstein making a logical claim, nor even a Tracton Hegel making a very involved dialectical claim, right?
Okay. I want to ask about a relationship that would help this all fall into place immediately for me. I have a religious friend, a very deeply religious friend. He's very high in his local Anglican church.
Oh, I know about.
And he even teaches. You met him, Check Ye.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And okay, once I was driving with him, and we've been discussing something. He knows that I'm an atheist.
Yes.
And he's long been accommodated to that.
Yes.
But at one point he was talking about somebody else being atheistic, and he said they do not understand the mystery. Mm-hmm. And since I didn't either, I simply shut up.
Yes.
And then I said, "Oh my God, does he worship a black hole, like in space? You know, a black hole?" And I said, "Mystery, gosh," and I left it. But is this related to the same usage?
Well, I mean, he definitely speaks directly of the mystery of being, and even the promise of the mystery of being.
He's talking about the mystery of God, of course. My friend.
I understand, but what does the mystery mean? So the mystery is a term of art here, and it's made even more of in an essay called On the Essence of Truth, where, the mystery is something like what is worthy of thought in what has been unthought up until now. It is also
unthinkable.
It's not that it's unthinkable, it's that it's unthought. So one of the things being discussed here is the truth about the essence of truth, right? The claim, going back to the Greeks, is that the essence of truth is unconcealment, or the sense of things standing in the light, or standing in the open, or appearing to in the open, in a collected, lighted up place. There's something like that, which is a direct phenomenological description of the experience of consciousness of a truth, right? And when Heidegger talks about the essence of truth, he's thinking of essence in this ongoing, unfolding sense, not just in the sense of an abstracted out of all of its instances, factored, common sense. And that sense of the appearing in the lightening or the opening of something like consciousness. That's a description of truth, and the place where it happens will be described as the open, or even the free open. So what does the mystery mean? The mystery means if unconcealment is the appearing of something luminously as what is in that space, the mystery is that out of which it appears. It is the concealed into which that unconcealment transpires. Okay. Unconcealment is experienced as a transpiring event of a coming into, right, a lighted region. And something can only come into a lighted region if it wasn't in a lighted region before. Where was it before? It was in the mystery. So there's a kind of topology of the areas, the mental areas of thought, something like that, which are categories, if you want to put it this way. Where the wheres into which we necessarily sort what we think of as the possible or actual contents of our consciousness. But it's not just contents of our consciousness, because it's this is not simply about consciousness. This is about something like the base or ground of consciousness itself, right? Consciousness itself is one of the things that appears. In Being in Time, the formula for man's existence is that he is the there, the Da, in which being appears, right? The there or site in which being appears is meant to be a far more phenomenologically accurate and exact replacement for the loose slipshod term consciousness, if I put it that way, right? It's where such events as are experienced to transpire, which includes a there sense and a in time, not even sense. They include in timeness, they include actualization. Actualization, in timeness, ongoing activity, and appearing in a lighted region are all part of the site or there in which being happens, and man's essence is to be the place or site in which that appearing can occur, right? All right, so what does it mean to say that the truth doesn't appear? It means something like thinking in this essential sense does not happen. So the diagnosis of what the essence of nihilism is going to be, well, he gives the cruder earlier formula. Nihilism is that history in which nothing much happens with being, or which in which being amounts to nothing, right? Which can mean being is taken as nothing, but that's is taken as is the wrong note for it. From his own standpoint, as opposed to inside metaphysics, he will describe that further as it is when being stays away from the site where it could appear. Now, I'm going to translate into theological register at the risk of making this way more contentious than it need to be. There is no revelation going on. There is a period in man's history in which he is bereft of revelation. That's nihilism. A man's history in which revelation was a continuous, ongoing, leading and enlightening event would not be nihilism. But a history of man in which no revelation of the truth of being occurs, it's not quite that that's nihilism. It's close to nihilism. But yeah, that's one of the senses of it. So there was a late Greek thought, if I can put it this way, in the decline of the ancient world, where they spoke of the flight of the gods. The gods used to interact with Greek mankind, but whether because mankind lost their belief in the gods or because the gods got sick of these worthless people, the gods left. And the cry went out that great Pan is dead. This is a precursor to Nietzsche in the ancient world. And the skies are empty because the gods left, right? So that is the register on which you have to hear something like, nothing is happening to being. And this is meant to be a faithful translation of what Nietzsche is describing as the highest values devaluing themselves, but no longer viewed from inside Nietzsche's nihilistic metaphysics, but viewed, if I could put it this way, from outside of it in a history in which nihilism or the nothingness of being are not taken to be a matter of course, right? So, okay. Does Heidegger think that all that is necessary for revelation to recommence is for people to read his works with sufficient care and meditate on the truth of being? It may be doubted. But he would like to think that he is contributing in that direction by at least, if nothing else, by calling forth an essential need. He wants to make people wish that that were possible, something like that. Okay, but this is the point that I was making about how there's an almost theological register to the second half of this essay. It reminds me of Kierkegaard in some ways there, especially in the Sickness Unto Death book, but perhaps because of a similar subject matter. Pete, initial reactions to the essay or reactions to the things I've been saying for the last hour?
So my reaction to the essay, I guess, is well, a lot of it is recategorizing nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he starts from the dictionary definition and what does Nietzsche mean. Eventually, he gets well, metaphysics is nihilism.
Yes.
And okay, well, we're on familiar territory here with Heidegger. He's just starting from nihilism this time. There were some interesting things with the mystery and being in time. I think the mystery and being in time is thrownness, that we find ourselves thrown, and that's the short one sentence explanation. You gave the longer explanation.
I think that that there is something mysterious about the world is already there in the anthropology of being in time. I'll agree. I think that the term the mystery by the time of something like the essay on the essence of truth, it's become a more technical term for something happening in history than by then. But yes, if I even put this in, if you think back before the Greek metaphysicians who discourse on being and nature, before them there were men who discoursed on gods, said Aristotle, right? And they spoke of these things in terms of myth, right? And we saw a glimpse of that when we in volume 3, when we learned about chaos as the chasm, right? Mystery as the background out of which being or the ordered cosmos appears is a similar mythological structure, right? It's the kind of thing you would find in Joseph Campbell. You would have like a big circle around the world written the mystery, and then you would have like a settled city inside of it called being, right? That's the kind of image or topology you would get in a typical earlier mythological understanding. I think he uses it a bit more technically than that, but it's not misleading to see him as starting from that. And how is this related to the point I was making before about the different senses of being? To think that you are living in a single unfolding history that doesn't get do-overs and isn't in front of a for every, under a for every sign, but has count exactly one, in which particular decisions about future possibles matter, right? That is also to be living in mystery, right? What I mean by that is there's something about the positivist view or the systematized metaphysical philosophy view that doesn't leave room for an open. It doesn't leave room for an undecided. It wants to be a total explanation of everything that could happen from outside of time, so that nothing will actually happen inside of time, right? The completedness of that is the opposite of an open or free or undetermined, right? That's another sense in which mystery is an important term for Heidegger here, because one of the fundamental things going on here is that he's claiming that being has a history. Being, back to the Greeks, often meant exactly what doesn't have a history, exactly what never changes, cannot changes, is eternal, right? If it has change, then it's not being, Parmenides would have told you, right? But for him, being is an ongoing event that has change in it. And when something like the activity of the transcendental has change in it, there is mystery as to what will happen next, right? This comes back again at the end of this essay where he refers to some of the, there's a Nietzsche poem about the gods at play, which is kind of echoing Heraclitus of the throne of Zeus is in the hands of a playing child. There's this sense of future indeterminacy that is part of this transpiring event in time view of being, if I can put it that way. And where the opposite would be a completed total explanation for everything, in which there is no room for uncertainty or undecidedness, right? Heidegger is pretty convinced that no view of the latter form can be true to the phenomena, so to speak. Pete, other initial thoughts from the essay?
So I mean, I read through it, then I went through it backwards, and then just kind of dipped into it. I like the bits about the abode and dwelling in being, because I just read Building Dwelling Thinking with a different group a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
And I can see where he's going, and Building Dwelling Thinking's like 10 years after this.
Yes.
And I see where he's going. And one last thing, today I was dipping back into it, and I like the being is the food of thinking. And
yes, where it gives food for thought. The theme of being giving food for thought is a major sub-theme of the book, What is Called Thinking, which is also about Nietzsche. Its whole thing is a gloss on one line of Nietzsche: "The wasteland grows, woe to him who hides wastelands within." But what calls for thinking and what gives food for thought for thinking is kind of a recurring theme in that one, if you're interested in the food for thought stuff in the rest of Heidegger. Brian, first impressions. How comprehensible or incomprehensible was this? I think you're still on mute. Well, you came off mute, but there's not enough volume. I didn't see I saw your mute button go off, but you were not hearable anyway. It is a mic problem, is my guess. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. You don't know. You don't know how. Okay. We'll come back to you, but you can try to yeah. You can come back to you. I wanted to mention some of the other more extreme things mentioned at the end of this essay. He talks about the extreme threat to man, the danger that threatens to annihilate man's essence. By the end of this essay, he's going to relate the what he calls the visible nihilism, by which he means just sort of historical catastrophe in the world around us, to this earlier essential catastrophe. But that earlier essential catastrophe is something like a danger from consummate nihilism that man could lose his essence, where we have to understand, according to him, man's essence is to be the place or site in which the understanding of being transpires. So if the oblivion of being accelerates to the point of an actual consummated incomprehensibility of being, then there is a danger that threatens to annihilate man's essence. And one of the things that's striking to me about that is some of the earlier portions, he went from the claim that nihilism is what we see in Nietzsche to nihilism is something which we see in modern philosophy as such, and you can find these intimations going all the way back to Descartes. And then, heroic jump, nihilism is in all of metaphysics. And I've given you a little bit of some of the reasons why he says that, but it is at least a stretch that the same diagnosis of what is there in Nietzsche applies to all of metaphysics, right? It is more apparent in Nietzsche that being is being forgotten, downplayed, made nothing of, called the last wisp of evaporating reality, called the longest error, etc. in Nietzsche than in earlier metaphysics. And when you get to these later sections and he's talking about the threat to man's essence, it is worth asking, does that threat to man's essence begin as soon as Plato thinks of being as idea? Or does it only begin when Nietzsche finishes writing Ecce Homo?
So I think that there's something else that I noticed is, so it's 1940 and the war has started, and this danger that Heidegger is now seeing is a new danger. And in 8 years, in 48, he's going to have an essay called The Danger.
Sure.
And what he sees as the new danger, he sees it in the total war requisition, whereas with Nietzsche, you could say, well, it's human-centric, and Nietzsche in the 19th century lives in a world where everything is now for man instead of for God. Now the danger is that all things are not just there to serve man, but just have their position in the Gestalt. That is just the ordering of things to be of service. And this has happened in the war, where now the Reich ministries have taken over all productive capacity, all resources are now oriented towards the war, and even man is lost in that as just another resource ready to be put up for the front lines or for manufacturing.
Yes, you're absolutely right about all that, and the word for that is man becomes raw material, man becomes standing reserve himself, all that kind of stuff in the question concerning technology. Entirely agree with all that. But he also has traced that possibility back to Nietzsche's metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
It's the world viewed from inside may be will to power, but a world consisting entirely of will to power viewed from the outside by positivist manipulators looks like that, right? And yes, man, precisely as the one so threatens, exalts himself to the posture of Lord of the earth is a line in the question concerning technology, and Nietzsche is clearly meant, right? So there's a way in which the view of mankind as fallen to raw material in the technology understanding is just the philosophical dual of Nietzsche's overman doctrine, which has already seen mankind as raw material for future ordering and has seen the purpose of all values as the value they have for governing man's conduct, and what should govern man's conduct, the struggle for dominion of the earth, and what determines what is successful in the struggle for the dominion of the earth, power accumulation. So Heidegger has traced the deduction from which Nietzschean metaphysics consistently followed through results exactly in that Gestalt raw material view of humanity. And I agree with you that that is kind of the thing which he's calling the danger. He's also saying that that is the danger not simply because it reduces man to raw material, but because oblivion happens to being when that happens. There's a section in the 40s things where I think it's in the, might even be in the Parmenides. I think it's in the Parmenides, where he mentions how your ministers requisitioning everything are telling us that we don't need poetry and we don't need thought. We need ammunition and oil is what we need, right? And they're saying that anything which doesn't further our gathering up of more ammunition and oil is completely inessential, and we don't need any of this highfalutin spiritual metaphysics and religious junk. We just want some more oil. So I agree with you on the danger part being partly contextual to the war. Some of it is, already scented, if I can put it that way, in the 30s before the war. But he also has traced all of that to Nietzschean metaphysics. But my point is that you cannot trace that to Aristotle's metaphysics. It's an extreme stretch to trace it to Kant's metaphysics or Descartes' metaphysics. You might find it in the will in Schopenhauer or Hegel, but you're certainly finding it in Nietzsche, and you're not finding it in Plato, right? So we went rather easily from metaphysics is the history in which nothing happens to being to all of metaphysics is nihilism, to nihilism threatens to the oblivion of being or completely cutting man off from his essence, to this extreme danger we see from consummate subjectivity. But somehow the extreme danger from consummate subjectivity is now tainting the entire history of metaphysics, because they're both tagged with this nihilism word, right? I think it's fair to say that it is not Nietzschean or Cartesian to have the Reich Ministry control all production of everything for the sake of raw material, so to speak. Okay, but fair point. Okay, I want to get to ontology and theology, but I want to start off with the, we talked about the what metaphysics does not think and why. Can we go back to that for a second? So I tried to talk about this a little bit at the beginning, but I want to be more, if it can help, get more specific about what it is that metaphysics does not think. He says, being remains unthought of metaphysics as such. Okay. Yeah, this is related to the Okay.
What page?
I'm talking at 210, where he's talking about as an ontology, even Nietzsche's metaphysics, at the same time as theology. Ontology of beings thinks essentia is will to power, and existentia of beings as such and as a whole, as external currents the same, right? And this is the point where he explains that the God is dead is an expression of ontotheology. Right. It thinks being in the sense of the being as such. Ontology and theology on the basis of mutual dependence on each other must both leave being unthought. And this is the question about right. Okay. All right. Let's go back all the way to 207. Right. The claim is made. The question, what is the being, the truly existing as thought at the same time with respect to essentia and existentia? Accordingly, how does being itself comport itself to being itself? Does metaphysics think being itself? No, it never does. It thinks the being with a view to being. Being is first and last what answers the question in which the being is always what is interrogated. What does he mean by that? I'm going to give you a translation, and you can see if it works for you. Actuality is only what answers the question which any given being, when it is any given being, for every mapped over beings, that is always being interrogated. So he's saying that metaphysics is always asking questions about what is true for every being, right? And what is true for every being is ousia, or the being of beings, or the being here, right? That which is true of the being as such is that which is true of the for every mapped over beings. And he says that being is first and last what answers the question in which that for every being is always what is interrogated. So metaphysics always wants to know what claims it can say about for every being that are true. And the only use it makes of actuality is to consult actuality from time to time to see whether or not one of its universal claims about beings as such is refuted by actuality, right? The point here being that we're distinguishing between the being that only answers questions about the for every, and that being has the sense of actual, and the part which is just the being, which is always what is interrogated, always has the form of a function, which is meant to apply to every being. It's meant to be a function into which any being can be applied, and you get some true statement out of it. That's what metaphysics is always trying to do. It's always trying to find you invariants of beings that are true universal statements can be made about all beings because they're true of beings as such, right? And that means anything which is particular is by definition excluded, including the particular actuality of the actual course of actual history, which has count exactly 1. So that, I claim, is what he's saying. It does not think itself. What is interrogated is not being as such. Being remains unthought in metaphysics, not just incidentally, but in accord with its own inquiry. By thinking the being as such, the question and the answer necessarily think on the basis of being, because they want to know what's true about all beings, but they do not think about being itself, precisely because in the proper sense, the metaphysical question of being is thought of as the being in its being. It's thought of as the universal. It's thought of as the functor for every applied to all beings. Inasmuch as metaphysics thinks to be the being on the basis of being, it does not think being as being. Being remains unthought in the kind of thinking that metaphysical passes for thinking pure and simple, that being itself remains unthought in metaphysics as such, is a remaining unthought of a peculiar, distinctive, and unique kind. And so much of the rest of the essay is going to depend upon that I wanted to just try to have that as clear as possible in our heads. That's the kind of thing that can look just like a bare claim that hasn't been substantiated at all, right? But I think it actually follows from the definition of metaphysics, if metaphysics is concerned only with what is true of beings as such and as a whole.
Can you give me a page that I can mark on that?
Sorry, this is page 207. The second full paragraph, where he says, does metaphysics think being itself? No, it never does.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. The next claim he makes is that when metaphysics does want to think about being with a capital B, as opposed to what's true of beings as such, it thinks of it as the a priori. So the only other view of being with a capital B that this functional for every being view has, or has room for, is the condition of possibility of some invariant of that function, if I can put it that way. So if that function has some, if there's some claim that you can make about it for every being, because of some underlying, that's a possible meaning to capital B being, right? That is, it has room for an essence such that all the all the individual things in its for every would be consequences of that universal definition. And that that prior sense of universal is the only meaning that metaphysics as such is prepared to see in being with a capital B. Another way of putting that is that to metaphysics, being with a capital B is always a concept. It's not a reality, it's not an actuality, it's an abstraction. Okay. That every metaphysics, even the reversal of Platonism, thinking of Nietzsche, thinks the being of beings as the a priori merely certifies that metaphysics as such leaves being unthought. Now, that's the kind of claim that is only true if you have some sense of being in your head that is distinct from the a priori, which Heidegger clearly does. But my point is, you might think that the content of the concept being is something we're still deciding as philosophers. And if we choose to have it be X rather than Y, we could choose a meaning for it where it always meant something a priori, and then having always thought of it in terms of the a priori would not have left being out at all or left being unthought. It just would have thought of it as in a different way than Heidegger thinks about it, something like that. But that's not what he's saying here. He's saying that being clearly has a meaning that is broader than the a priori, that is less abstract than the a priori. And that sense is the essentially transpiring in time sense of being in the active verbal sense, being as what the beings do. Okay. Page 208, the grounding of being, which is barely remembered. He's talking about how metaphysics thinks about being again. In the utmost being, into the previous paragraph. Scarcely has it thought about being as such, then it transforms it into a being, whether it be the supreme being in the sense of the first cause, whether it be the distinctive being in the sense of the subject of subjectivity as the condition of the possibility of all objectivity, or whether as a consequence of the adherence of both these fundamental conditions of being in beings, it be the determination of the supreme being as the absolute in the sense of unconditioned subjectivity. That is a very concentrated paragraph. What he's saying is whether you're thinking of first cause or Kantian thinking of itself as a transcendent, or like Hegel, you see first cause and Kantian thinking of itself as synthesized as the activity of the thing in itself as the absolute subject. All three of those are going to be ways in which you replace being the concept with a single highest being, right? So you're not looking away from the individual being or the for every being in the direction of a concept anymore. And you're also not looking away in terms of towards the actuality as opposed to the essence. But you're creating a single instance, right? There is one special being. Maybe that special being is the whole, right? That takes the role of actuality, right? It takes the role of it takes the role of actuality. It's the opposite pole of particular essence. Okay, it says the grounding of being which is barely remembered in the utmost being among beings proceeds to metaphysical question about the being as such. It discovers that beings are. The fact that being essentially occurs brushes by it. This is where I'm substantiating my claim that this is all about this active, ongoing verbal sense of being. The fact that being essentially occurs brushes by it. But the later experience indiscernibly attains the path of metaphysical question of Leibniz. Why are there beings rather than nothing? This question inquires into the first cause and highest existent ground. This is the question of the theon. A question that had already risen in the metaphysics of Plato and Aristotle. Because metaphysics thinking the being itself is approached by being, but thinks it on the basis of reference to beings. Metaphysics must therefore say the theon in the sense of the highest existent ground. So there is some actual existent, some actuality in which actualization itself is grounded. And that is the closest that metaphysics gets to thinking about something like actuality with its full time dimension, so to speak, as something more than a concept, as the actually real, something like that. So the closest thing you get to an actual in metaphysics is an absolute concept, a first cause, a God term from which actualization descends, right? So there's an imagined essential order in which actualization is from a single ground function of the action of a single being, of a single highest being. And that structure is what he's calling ontotheology here. The fact that metaphysics gives you some definition of being in which actualization is thought of as just a function of the highest being is what he's calling the ontotheological structure in metaphysics.
And so Heidegger's answer to his question, does metaphysics think being itself? No, it never does.
Yes.
He means metaphysics never thinks the event of being.
That's right. That's right. The ongoing event of being happening, the essential unfolding, actualization in time of the single stream of history, that sense of being as the ongoing appearing is what he's saying metaphysics does not think. He'll even in the Parmenides say that, before Platonic metaphysics, so to speak, at the dawn of Greek thinking, glimpses of that are there, right? That sense is there in the early Greek thinkers. But by the time you're at the determinate metaphysics of either Plato or Aristotle, the claim is it has disappeared. I think that that's something which is, to me, contentious as to both of them. I think that it is true of most of their followers after them, but Plato is definitely trying to think about, it's fair to say that he is thinking about the being of the being or of the beings, but he's doing that as a conscious step forward after Parmenides. He thinks that Parmenides has already explained what can and cannot be known about being, capital B, as such, and he now wants to know what can be known about the beings. It's not because he's forgotten being, it's because Parmenides covered that. But he covered that as the divine road. The path of mortals is the path along which to be and not to be are the same and not the same. This is Parmenides. And that's the path of the ideas. To think that that sameness or essential definition is the cause of the manifold of what appears, right? That's what you get as the that's the way in which young Socrates in the Parmenides thinks of himself as taking a step beyond Parmenides, right? But not a step beyond in the sense of against, but in the sense of how things stand with being. Parmenides has discussed how things stands with the things which appear, with the manifold, has to be explicated. And from Plato's point of view, the fundamental problem there is how something like true understanding of an eternal truth can happen in time. And that's what something like the ideas are meant to explain. But anyway, that's just Platonic aside. Aristotle, on the other hand, is going to disagree with a bunch of that essentiality in Plato as being too essential and too abstracted away from the particulars. And Aristotle is going to have something like the activity of the individual thing as something like its existence, right? The energeia of the combined body and form, right, is its activity, the act that it performs. Now, it's fair to say that that is still the activity of a being. So Heidegger is right here that he's talking about something like the being of the beings, but it is still trying to understand at the level of that forevery, the in-timeness, the actualization, the time component of being. That's already there in Aristotle. It differentiates Aristotle from Plato, the way he handles it, but Aristotle is already trying to deal with the problematic of the individual material thing is and is in time, and the whole issue of its activity and its actualization, it's the reason that he's not a Platonist, is because he thinks that Plato hasn't done justice to that that way in which the form itself of something is not enough for the full thing or its activity in time to be, right? So the move to the particulars in Aristotle, away from the ideas in Plato, is already a move in the direction Heidegger wants to go. It's just not far enough for him, not remotely far enough for him. But I wanted to point that out, as this is one of the things that Pete and I were discussing online. Okay, but all this is meant to be his substantiating his claim that metaphysics as such is nihilism proper, right? Metaphysics thinks the being by surpassing it transcendentally only in order to represent the being itself, that is, to return to it again. Being is, as it were, skimmed over representationally in the transcendental, transcendent act of surpassing. The thing that surpasses always passes over being itself in thought, not as an oversight, but in such a way that it does not enter into being as such. What is question one its truth? That's very difficult language. What he's trying to say there is that what appears in metaphysics as the transcendental structures are always pointing towards this actualization question. They're always pointing towards this question of how does the actual or the in time get sewn together with the order of the essences, right? And from Heidegger's point of view, that is the way in which it skims the question of being, right? It touches it, but it never directly confronts it or discusses it as anything like the problem of being itself, certainly not as the problem of being itself on the background of time, right? Which is, Heidegger's own starting point. Okay. After he lays all that out about how metaphysics thinks nihilistically or misses being, he then says, this is not enough to think about this the right way. And what he means by that, this is the beginning of, sorry, late on 211. What he means by that is that none of this is yet his own way of thinking about the history. It's just pointing out the fact that as far as he is concerned, the metaphysics isn't thinking about its own history. It is because it isn't thinking about history, right? He makes the claim a little bit later that metaphysics cannot explain its own action, meaning the event that this philosophy thought this in history is not something that is in the sphere of the actions that metaphysics is considering. I think that that's true of all the older metaphysics. It's less obvious that it's true of the Hegels and Nietzsches of the world, but they can be stretched to that. I'm just pointing out that some of the later German idealist influenced philosophers are already thinking about their action in history as essential to the content of their philosophy, something like that. But not because, to be fair, not because they're thinking directly about time primarily. But we'll get later to the ways, well, not later, next time, the ways in which Heidegger may be indebted to Nietzsche and for various things. But okay, so all of this is he substantiated the claim that there's something missing being in some sense in metaphysics as such. And then he says, noticing that isn't enough to give us a correct understanding of the history that transpires in metaphysics. To see the history that transpires in metaphysics, we have to look at it from the standpoint of my own kind of existential happening view of history, right? And only from that full view will we see metaphysics as it should properly be seen, which is not how it sees itself. So very clear distinction here. There's how metaphysics understands itself and what it stands its own activity to be. And the claim is because it is blind to its basis and its and the things it necessarily misses, the only proper understanding of the historical import of metaphysics, I can put it that way, occurs from outside metaphysics itself, looking at it from a different perspective. And that different perspective is one in which, especially history, the history of truth, the history of the unveiling of being, is the fundamental horizon within which metaphysics is viewed, right? Now there's an easy sense and a hard sense in which this can be maintained. The easy sense, which we almost kind of got up to this point even before this essay, will be something like each metaphysical position is trying to understand the nature of truth and the nature of the whole in a single static way that does not understand the fact that it is just a term in an historical structure that is varying, right? They're all trying to be single snapshot eternal views. None of them are movies, right? That's sort of the easy way in which this is kind of obviously true. But there's another harder way in this essay, which is the claim that even after you see that it has to be a movie, not a snapshot, right? The movie has a plot. The movie has a theme. The theme is the omission of the staying away of being, right? So the next section of the essay is all of this, if I can put it this way, kind of convoluted negative conceptual thinking about the history. Why do I call it convoluted and negative, right? Because you're reasoning about absences. You're thinking about the phenomena of staying away. You're thinking about the phenomena of staying away itself being forgotten, right? So he has a formula at one point. Was it the veil that vanishes, right? The veil that vanishes is the nothing as being itself. That's the claim. what the heck does he mean when he says the veil that vanishes is the nothing of being itself? Can you find a I put it to you that you could easily find that line in like a medieval Eckhart mystic or something. You might find it in Al-Ghazali, right? But what does this sentence mean? The veil that vanishes is the nothing of being itself. Joe, you're on mute.
I was just saying, what page are you on?
Oh, good question. The veil that vanishes. Where is this? It's after the ontotheology, several pages after the ontotheology stuff. So where are we? Right. Here it is, 214. Right. The first full paragraph, second paragraph on the page, with the first one that starts on the page. In its default, being veils itself with itself. This veil that vanishes for itself, which is the way being itself essentially occurs in default, which is actually staying away, is the nothing as being itself. So I've dropped out the which clause from the middle of that sentence and just joined the first clause with the last clause, and I get this veil that vanishes for itself is the nothing as being itself.
Yeah, and so this makes sense in the being, when it reveals beings, withdraws, and it withdraws into the nothing that the beings came out of.
But he doesn't call it. He says this is the nothing as being itself, right? This is meant to be the nothing of the nihil in nihilism, right?
Right, from the 29 essay, What is Metaphysics?
Right. It is the hiddenness of being when being is only revealed as the being of beings. So being itself is thereby hidden,
Yes.
but that itself would only be a veil. The veil vanishing is the omission of the default, or the fact that what is in another context called the oblivion of being, that being is forgotten is itself forgotten, right? People don't know that they forgot being, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so
The veil that vanishes is the forgottenness of being, the Seinsvergessenheit.
right. But I just want to point out that the vanishing veil, right? The veil is the same veil as concealedness and unconcealedness, right? Right.
Yeah.
So something is concealed when something else veils it, when something else is in front of it that's preventing you from seeing it. But the something in front of it that's preventing you from seeing it here is beings.
Yes.
Right. The being of the beings, and the being of the beings has vanished in, I would put it, in Nietzsche. It has become the purely illusory. But that is the same as the being of the beings itself has vanished.
Well, I think the being of beings in Nietzsche is the beings as values, or
Yes, that's right. It's just it's values, but nihilism is the world becoming valueless. There's this endless and still more doubling of the obscurity of not only claiming that something is unthought, but claiming that the fact that it is unthought is forgotten, right? And the fact that it is unthought and forgotten is buried under the mystery, wrapped inside the enigma, underneath the bushel of, lots, et cetera. You get the point. but this staying away. A little bit later, he gets much more concrete, and this is where I think he leaves the heights of mystical wordplay, if I can put it that way, and he drops back to the phenomenological. He says the withdrawal happens, right? The abandonment by being of beings as such is an event. That's the claim. So he's pointing to an historical sense here. There is the happening in time of the stream of human thoughts as the locus in which these events occur, right? Okay. The other thing that's noticeable there is the passive voice, right? Later he'll be telling you all the things that being is doing, right? He's not yet telling you all the things that being is doing. He's just saying the withdrawal happens. He does not say Descartes forgot to think about being, right? We're moving from the register of these things being the particular thought claims of particular philosophers that might be disputed in the history to something like the essential history itself unfolding by its own logic, where the actors are, sorry?
The middle voice here, I think he's reaching for.
Yes. He says, being itself withdraws, the withdrawal happens. Yes, when did it happen? Now, only yesterday, or a long time ago? How long has it been, etc. Metaphysics has prevailed ever since this unconcealment occurred. For metaphysics is the history of the unconcealment of the being as such. Since that history came to be, there has historically been a withdrawal of being itself. There has been abandonment by being of beings as such. There has been a history in which there is nothing to being itself. So from that time on, being is meant in a thought. So partly that is just, he's trying to show you the sense in which his formula that metaphysics is the history in which nothing happens to being itself is substantiated by all the other things he's said, right? He does this. He gives you a compact formula that seems an outrageously large claim when he first makes it, and then he'll, try to make it comprehensible and tie it back to things which you can verify for yourself. But in this case, the place in which those possible verifications are happening is something like an essential philosophical history. Okay. We have to talk about the sense in which being is active here. I gotta get a cup of coffee, so I'm gonna break for just a second. Hello, I think we're back. Got a second? Let me know if you're ready.
Ready.
Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about the, there's this thing that's going on between like the first third of the essay and maybe the second third, where being comes from being this incredibly abstract concept to being an acting hero in a story, if I can put it that way. We suddenly start being told all the things that being is doing, and all the ways in which man is relating this way and that way to being, but being is staying away, and it has a need for the abode or site in which it can appear, and it's has a coquettish relationship with thinkers, and etc. Right? It starts getting character, if I can put it that way, and it's an attractive character whose withdrawal lays claims upon us and twofold claims upon us. Etc. But we go from just this notion of being as unthought to the history of being as the history of being's acts, of the almost deliberate things that being has done or refrained from doing at different points in time, to which man has or has not responded, so to speak. So first point is, did anyone else detect that change in voice, that change in sense of agency ascribed to being?
Not what page did that happen. When I reread, I'll be more alert.
I mean, it's
just about what, about when we change the topic.
It's not on a page. This is the point. It starts, I think it first starts with being staying away, right? The essence of nihilism proper is being itself, this top of 216, being itself in staying away, this, in default of its unconcealment, the staying away of its unconcealment, which is as its own it and which determines its it in staying away. So it's determining itself as staying away. Thinking belongs to being itself insofar as thinking true to its essence maintains access to something that never comes to being as such from just anywhere, but approaches from being itself, and indeed as itself, and is being itself with all. He's saying that thinking is. This is also the shelter in the Advent, right? The staying away of unconcealment and the staying of concealment do not subsequently search about for an abode. Rather, the abode occurs essentially with them as the advent that being itself is. The advent is in itself the advent of their abode. The locale of the place of being as such is being itself. That locale, however, is the essence of man. Okay, so now we're getting man related to being. Right. Being itself applies to man along with his essence. Man's thinking rests on being itself, which can withdraw as such and does withdraw by showing itself in beings as such. So those are various actions that being has done. This is on 218. 219, it happens only that being as such stays away. Right. 220. In staying away, being abandons the thinking of metaphysics to its own nature, which is precisely to admit the defaults as such, not to involve itself in the admission.
Yeah, so it's being pretty active for something that is not a thing.
Yes. It's being very active. And some of those things are still things where we're talking primarily about the activity of thinking as authentic or non-authentic on the other side, but it's going to keep going, right? That being withdraws is precisely the relationship that claims the essence of man. Being itself saves itself in its default. The self-concealed withdrawal being itself is imbued by being with its preserving essence. The essence, and then by 227, we've gotten to the essence of metaphysics consists in the fact that it is the history of the secret of the promise of being itself. Right, so all of this is not simply what thought does. There's a wonderful line in the Essence of Truth essay where he mentions that the essence of truth is freedom, and then after he's explained this a little bit, he says, resistance to the proposition that the essence of truth is freedom is based upon misconceptions, the most obstinate of which is that freedom is a property of man, right? He wants freedom to be a property of the free region or of the relationship between man and being or of being itself. And there's a summoning and okay. Right. So the point that I'm making here is that a bunch of these things are, if I put it this way, the acts of being, right? By which I do not mean a particular being transpiring in history and thus acting out its essence, but instead this high concept of something like the actuality of the actual entering into dialectical philosophical relationships with the essence of man and being in dialogue with that essence, right? And the closest parallel to this is well, not closest. There are close parallels to this in theological context. If I can put it this way. This is the way people talk who are talking about whether or not mankind is listening to and responding to the promptings of God. Right? It's exactly how that register thinks. If that's the right word. It is thinking in that register, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. I want to talk about the things he's saying about authenticity and inauthenticity, the authentic and inauthentic nihilism, because this is quite complicated. And there's a whole notion of authenticity and inauthenticity in being in time that some people read as Heidegger's substitute for a morality that is otherwise missing, so to speak. Can you translate authentic with good or moral and inauthentic with evil or bad, right? This is the kind of problematic people bring to Heidegger from the outside, so to speak. But here he's trying to talk about what is authentic and inauthentic in nihilism, where by nihilism he's meaning something like this staying away of being itself. So if from Heidegger's point of view, history of nihilism is the history of the staying away of being itself, what is inauthentic in nihilism? What is inauthentic in nihilism is something like mankind not responding to the claims of being that he feels or hears even in metaphysics, right? By authentic, inauthentic, you gotta read something like honest and lying to yourself, right? There's a way in which the stuck in the structures of metaphysics notion here is it can have an inauthentic dimension. The inauthentic dimension is when the absence of being itself is not experienced as an absence, right? There's a falsification of what is going on in the oblivion of direct experience of being, or in forgetting it, because mankind always already has access to being as the transpiring event, right? As the ongoing revealing. It's always there, right? And the inauthentic response to it is not, there's more than one inauthentic response to it. The inauthentic response to it that he is talking about here is the one that diagnoses nihilism nihilistically, right? The Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism, right? I'm gonna put it in the other register for a second, right? Nietzsche says God is dead. It's God's fault that he's not here and he's left us all alone, right? But what do you expect from the no good scoundrel, right? Right? So of course we're left to our own devices. We always are. That's the kind of guy God is. I'm being absurd, right? But the point is that would be an inauthentic response to abandonment of the world by God. Translate all those things from the Nietzschean atheism register into the Heidegger oblivion of being register, and I claim you get the kind of inauthenticity he's talking about. Being is not appearing to man, is willfully, cynically, resentfully misrepresented by man as being nothing, unimportant, just a concept, empty, the last wisp of evaporating reality, right? So there's a kind of diagnosis of the dismissals of being throughout the history of metaphysics, that they are an inauthentic response to the abandonment of thinking by being itself, right? As though being itself longs for the revelations of being, wishes it had them when they're not there, is resentful at their absence, and spiteful at the thing which has disappointed it. Something like that. That's the inauthenticity in nihilism. I'm going to translate this a little bit more psychologically for the case of Nietzsche himself. Nietzsche is telling you that truth is an illusion because he's stuck in despair. In the Kierkegaardian register, that's the kind of diagnosis that's going on here. He has despaired of the truth, so he says, truth is an illusion. And that's the inauthenticity of nihilism, right? So instead of chasing after the still possible authentic experiences of glimpses of being that he could have had access to, he has given up and is stomping his feet. That's the inauthenticity in nihilism. So whereas Heidegger is trying to contrast this with, to authentically experience nihilism as the staying away of being is to be stunned by nihilism on the one hand, and to feel the loss of being staying away, something like that. So this echoes back to some of the things you get in Being in Time. I'm partly reading in the feeling the loss because you can, what he actually talks about is the claims that being makes upon us in its withdrawal, right? And the essential pull that it has on thinking, right? Okay. And this is related to the wanting to overcome nihilism. So the claim is that I think it's in the question concerning technology that the claim is made that nihilism cannot be overcome because overcoming is inherently nihilistic, right? There's something like that presaged here, that overcoming in the sense of bringing under one's own power, right, is exactly what can't get you out of nihilism. So he talks about wanting to overcome being itself. And this is where you have to read this as almost a charge of impiety directed at Nietzsche, right? The hinge of man's essence consists in the fact that being, even as staying away, lays claim to the essence of man.
Page?
Bottom of 223, top of 224. That essence is the abode which being itself provides for itself, the Da, so that it might proceed to such an abode as the advent of unconcealment. To want to overcome being itself would mean unhinging the essence of man. One could understand the impossibility of such a plan if it were just some absurd gesture of thought. One thinks on the basis of being while wanting to launch an attack against being. And he doesn't care if it's absurd. What is at stake here is not merely whether thinking taken for itself contradicts itself. Quite often human thought is contradictory, he says. So what? The real question is that such an attack on being rises to renounce being itself and pursues the surrender of man's essential possibility. That pursuit, despite its absurdity and logical impossibility, could be fatefully realized, right? So the claim is doesn't matter how absurd it is to reject being, if man renounces being itself, he could close himself off from the possibility of experiencing the unveiling of being. Right? So the calls this the dismal relapse into inauthenticity of essence. So the point is that there's something like a claim here that it is possible in nihilism to be in revolt against being itself, to be hostile to man's essence as the place or site in which being happens, where the basis of the hostility is the withdrawal of being, the non-evidentness of things, you can put it this way, or the non-revelation of being to man, giving rise to such a resentment that there's an attack on being, that wants to deny being, and that wants to renounce man's essence as the place or site in which the revelation of being happens. It's like being points the finger and says, you go, I put a claim on you, you will be the place or site in which being is revealed. And the man says, I don't wanna, stamps his feet, turns his back. That's the image being shown here, right? Okay. He talks about advancing on the omission of the default. Okay, so he's trying to explain the ways in which overcoming is nihilistic and the ways in which getting out of nihilism cannot be accomplished by overcoming, right? It can only be accomplished to the extent that it can be accomplished by heeding the claim on the essence of man that being itself always makes. This is something like there is a sense of a responsibility or piety of thought that is honest attention to what is revealed to you, and to deny or turn away from that is to destroy man's essence. And the only way out of nihilism as the withdrawal of being is to instead listen to the claim of being and heed the call of its advent, which he calls first taking the decisive step back from the omission, meaning I want to contrast all this to all the stuff we were hearing in all the chapters about subjectivity in 3s and 4, where it was, man standing on his own. This is the opposite of man standing on his own. Man is standing on being. And if he doesn't dependently respond to claims that being has upon him, he will be lost. So this is in the vein of all who tell you that man standing on his own is pride, and it goeth before a fall. Okay. Next he talks about the promise and the mystery. Okay, and he says that metaphysics first attains its essence when we think of it as, in terms of the history of being, as the possibility of getting out of it by the step back that heeds the call of being, something like that. And then 229, the claim is that the surface nihilism, the nihilism of no standards that we see around us, right, is based on the deeper one. How does the way out of the deep one begin? It begins just as a feeling of the lack, right? There needs to be the step back is the acknowledgement of the lack that mankind does not see the unveiledness of being, something like that. Revelation is not occurring to him. Right. The mode of this primordial summoning of being to man is the default, that is the staying away, the unconcealment of being and the unconcealed being as such. Okay. So I put it to you that much of this up to like, 234, right, amounts to something like a claim that there is something like a piety of thought, which is not a theological piety, but is a duty of honesty towards being, or towards man's dignity, or towards man's essence, some combination of those things, that is only realizable in thinking that pays attention to the claims of being, which is something like the claims of not just truthfulness, but a particular form of truthfulness which is attentive to the evidence of actuality, something like that. Okay, I've driven you far into the later parts of the essay, and I don't know how comprehensible any of that was. Did any of those sort of, I'll put it this way, moralizing notes register with anyone else, or were they completely incomprehensible?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Brian.
Oh my God, I'm signed on again. It's been
Yes,
a
you
chore.
are.
So I'll just listen. I just got back on.
I understand.
Oh, I thought I heard you call me.
Pete, did you have reactions to any of that?
Yes, I never know what to go. I mean, so every once in a while, Heidegger picks up this things that sound like moral assertions, but then a few pages later, he'll say, "Well, I'm not making a moral point here. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's inauthentic, not in a bad sense." And at some point, he says, I think, about nihilism, but not in a bad sense.
Well, I mean, but to be clear here, I mean, hang on, to be clear here, I can hear you, but the nihilism, not in a bad sense part, is essential to him because he's trying to claim that from his own point of view, there's a kind of view of nihilism or of the history of metaphysics from the outside that sees in it food for thought and the arising of the promise, or something like this, which is something like the clues we need to think about the unveiling of being, right? So there's a sense in which there is something not simply negative in the history of metaphysics or in nihilism, because if we have thought it through, we notice the withdrawal of being within it, and that is already the promise of the possibility of experiencing it directly and of being unveiled to us, right? So yeah. This is partly just the dialectical thinking of when you notice an absence, you know the absence can be cured, something like that. But anyway, so that's just about nihilism itself having a positive note, potential positive note.
Yeah, but so the moralistic tenor of these pages, the early 230s.
Yes.
I'm never sure how to take it when Heidegger is making what sounds like a moral claim, but he's later going to say, maybe not.
I mean, I got to tell you, I mean, in this one, he's not only not going to take it back, he is going to shift it up into the mystical theological register. By 244, he's describing being in a way that can be described as warbling, right? As the advent that never abandoned its abode. Being is the unrelenting. In this way, it is the compelling. Being occurs essentially in this way to the extent that as the advent of unconcealment, it requires unconcealment, not as something alien, but as being. Being needs an abode, requiring an abode, being lays claims to it. Being is compelling in the twofold harmonious sense. It is unrelenting and needful in relating to an abode that essentially occurs as the essence to which man belongs, man being the one who is needed. What is doubly compelling is and is called the need. In the advent of the default of its unconcealment, being itself is need. So this is being unrelentingly laying claim to something that it requires of the essence of man, right? This is on bottom page 244. This is a love affair between the thinker and being, in which being is unrelentingly pitching woo to the thinker, asking to be thought.
Right, but what is the thinker, being asked to do here, apart from listening to being?
Definitely providing the abode in which listening unconcealment can occur. Absolutely, that is mostly listening or listening responding. But how to put it? There is a that is beyond a moralizing of thought. This is a piety of thought that is on the level of the claims of a love affair, right? It's you'd be a cad to spurn being, right?
It's not the done thing.
It's not just not a done thing. It's yeah. So and that's not presented as anything for the sake of its effects. It is man's essential nature to be claimed by being in this way, right? And you to put this in a comparison, this is exactly the kind of thing you would find in like Kierkegaard, right? This is yeah. And then he talks about how being consigns itself to the danger that its need might never become for a historical man the need that it is. The outermost limit, the need of being comes to be the need of needlessness, right? And then he says that all the violence and despair of human culture and disruption and impotence of willings that we see around us is on the basis of that, that danger. Bigger than any danger to us is the danger to being, right? Who cares that it might destroy mankind? Who's gonna go in there and save the damsel in distress being who needs an abode in which to appear? Right? I'm exaggerating for clarity because it's easy to miss these things if you don't hear the note. Okay. Yes, and this is where 246, he talks about the vista of the extreme threat to man, the danger that threatens to annihilate his essence, which is thinking what is dangerous. And he talks about the need of being. By the way, the danger of needlessness is that the danger of the loss of man's essence is that man would think that he doesn't need being and therefore abandon being, right? That's the supreme danger.
I want to follow up on that
Sure.
point you just made.
Sure.
Like it's a love affair, and you say man is needed.
Yes.
But that's that's, if you will, the passive. It's being that needs man.
Yes.
But here's my question. Given that man, I don't know how to put this, but given that man exists, what being needs is man's comprehension or attention, so that man's openness to being.
Yes, that man think, in Heidegger's terms, that he think about being and thus provide the abode or site in which being can be unveiled. I'm going to take it to even the next level, 248. The default, I hate this word default, right? It's the staying away. The staying away of the concealment of being as such releases the evanescence of all that is hale in beings. Hale actually means holy here. The evanescence of the hale takes the openness of the holy with it and closes it off. The closure of the holy eclipses every illumination of the divine. The deepening dark entrenches and conceals the lack of God. The obscure lack lets all beings stand in the unfamiliar, even though the being, as what is objectified in limits of justification, seems to be a secure possession and is everywhere well known. The unfamiliarity of beings as such brings to light the homelessness of historical man within beings as a whole. The where of a dwelling in the midst of being as such seems obliterated because being itself, as the essential occurring of every abode, fails to appear. He basically just told you that the world is an unholy mess because piety itself has disappeared, and piety itself is thoughtful attending to the claims of truth upon us. This is a charge of impiety leveled against the modern world. The impiety involved is not an impiety towards any Christian God. It's not an impiety towards any God of Aristotle, and it's not an impiety towards the laws of logic. It's an impiety towards a duty of thinking that is thought as the essence of man. And he says, you know, man without that is homeless man. And homeless also means unholy.
But thinking, I think, as he's writing it, thinking properly understood, if you will, means man thinking of himself as a part of being.
It's not just as a part. It's not just as a part of being. It's man thinking of himself as the place or site in which the appearing of the truth essentially unfolds. It's a duty to the appearing of the truth. And the claim is that that is the source of what is holy in man and his essence and his highest duty, something like that. And that when that is neglected, of course, everything else goes to hell. This is his actual diagnosis of nihilism. Man has lost his piety towards the truth. So he has embraced philosophies of consummate subjectivity, which say that truth is a lie. That's Nietzsche. It's a useful lie, right? And that's supposed to save it, but it doesn't save it. Here's the question that Heidegger would have for every convinced Nietzschean, right? How does a Nietzschean know when he's lying to himself? Answer, because he's breathing. So that's the impiety or despair, to speak Kierkegaard, that he is detecting as nihilism. Okay, but it's, you know, there's no getting around the fact that in this essay, at least, the charge here is something like an impiety. He directly calls it the eclipsing of every illumination of the divine. I wanted to mention one other thing here, a word. We talked about the epoch of metaphysics and the epoche of being. And there's just a technical thing that people will not get at all if they don't know what the word epoch means. Yeah, he's talking about, this is still on 248, talking about the epoch of the concealment of being, and the unconcealment of being, etc. Sorry, I'm slightly distracted by the word epoch recurring again, but so you know, he will use as a technical term in other respects the epoche of being, right? Which is something like the suspension, right? That's actually the technical term that Husserl used for the piece of the phenomenological method where you bracket something. You suspend the claim, you put it in brackets, you don't particularly assert it, right? That's the same word as, same root word as our word epoch, epoche. Epoche was what the Greek skeptics said you should do with every claim in order to avoid being wrong. Suspend judgment. But he speaks here of the suspension of being, or the suspension of the ability of being. Sorry?
The epoch of the concealment of being doesn't mean a particular period of time, but the bracketed out being.
It does mean a particular period of time, but he's sorry. I have to I have to find the actual passage where he brings up the epoche instead of just the epoch, but he does. Where is it? You're going to have to give me a second to find it because I'm not finding it easily.
Yeah, this is one of the few Heidegger texts. I don't have the full text version, so I can't search it.
Yes. Here we are, page 239. Sorry, the paragraph starts at the end of 238 and it continues onto the top of 239. This is the essential unfolding of knowledge, the default of being as such. The default abandons itself to the omission of being as secret as history. As history, metaphysics keeps the truth of being concealed, the unconcealment of being as such. As the promise of its truth, being keeps to itself within its own essence. The admission of the omission of the default, there you go, takes place on the basis of this keeping to itself. In respect of difference of the withdrawal, which conceals itself in any given phase of metaphysics, such keeping to itself determines each epoch in the history of being as the epoche of being itself. In other words, each epoch of metaphysics remains in metaphysics because being itself remains bracketed, right?
And so that means that when he talks about the different being of beings, Plato had one, Aristotle, Kant, he's saying that in each of those, they're bracketing out being itself.
Exactly.
In different.
Right. He's saying in each epoch of metaphysics is marked by a particular interpretation of the essence of truth, but all of them are metaphysics because in all of them, being itself is bracketed. And that's the being withdrawn into its remotest withholding, right? And that's what he calls the epoche of being itself, right? So it becomes the shorthand form of this thing which has been ramified all the way into the what is it? The default of the omission, the default of the omission, right? The admission of the omission of the default, yeah, takes place on the basis of its keeping to itself, right? So that complicated formula just turns into epoche, right? Okay. Sorry, we were going all the way up to 248. We got this point about the hail and saw that, you know, there's an actual claim to a deepening dark that entrenches and conceals the lack of God. He said, in bottom of 248, he says, the essence of the destitution of this era in the history of being consists in the need of needlessness. What does he mean by that? Needlessness is people feeling that they do not need the revelation of being. They do not think they need truth, right? Their being needs man as the place or site in which truth happens or is unveiled, but man is in needlessness because he doesn't feel a corresponding need of that truth. Because it is more essential and older, the destiny of being is less familiar than the lack of God. So he's claiming here that the theological lack of God is based upon the deeper, even deeper than metaphysical lack of being, right? So I'm going to translate to a theological register even more. One of the reasons that metaphysics is the history of nihilism. Sorry, one of the reasons the history of metaphysics is nihilism, whereas the history of nihilism is that it's the thought formation of Western history in which nothing is happening to being, and God either is not or is only in the form of a single being in an ontotheology, right? Which has reified God into a concept of man, right? But any impiety of that form is based upon a deeper one of missing man's duty to the truth itself, right? And if you read the Parmenides essay, he says this. There's this wonderful long text from Parmenides with all this interesting philosophical material to get to, and he gets to the very first part of it, and he sees the youth is arriving at the gates of the goddess of truth, and that's as far as he gets, because in that little piece he said he learns that to Parmenides, truth is unveiledness, and it is truth is a goddess, and unveiledness is divine revelation of the goddess truth. That's as far as he gets in the Parmenides essay, and the claims about the way of being and the way of mortals and all the other stuff that philosophers care about in that essay, he never even gets to him. It's much more important what the word truth means, and the fact that for Parmenides, the natural place to discuss this is not even a myth. It's just to say truth is a goddess and understanding the truth is divine revelation. Not from any Judeo-Christian personal God, but from being. Okay. Yeah. So, and then he's going to end on the note that when people hear claims like this, they think that being is too abstract to pay any attention to and dismiss it. And that's exactly the flight from his own essence that we find in Homeless Man. Not only is man unacquainted with the truth of being, but whenever being crops up, he proclaims it to be a specter of sheer abstractions, thus mistakes it and repudiates it as vacuous nothingness. By surrendering all remembrance, instead of ceaselessly recollecting the essential historical fullness of the words being and to be, he hears mere terms whose empty reverberations he finds irritating. Right, and the only thing he's holding out against that is that if man responds to the claims of being, then he will feel the need of its lack. That is, the lack of the unconcealment of being. Okay. And then the claim is that being essentially occurs and that the freedom of the free region liberates all beings to themselves. And that is what is called for thinking. So there's a claim in which the truth is the free region in which being appears, to which man is called to honestly attend. Something like that. That's the substance of his piety of thought. All right, so reactions. I just laid a whole bunch of stuff on you about how all this is coming out in a very un-Nietzschean place, if I can put it that way. I put it to you that no one can finish this book and think that Heidegger and Nietzsche agree with each other. Joe, you're on.
I guess my reaction to this, that, you know, we have a duty or a piety that we should be listening to being. It's still hard to go from that sort of, you know, injunction towards what should we actually do in terms of how do we move from theory to praxis. You know, this is Zizek's critique in the parallax view, is that given, if we're going to concede to Heidegger that this is all true, how should we live our life differently?
Yes. And there's a clear answer, right? The clear answer is that something like philosophical thoughtfulness is way more important than what most people spend their time caring about. There's a line in the Introduction to Metaphysics where he puts an objection into the mouth of a student, imaginary student in the audience, who says that you can't do anything with philosophy, it's completely useless. And his rejoinder is that it's true, you can't do anything with philosophy, but if we concern ourselves with it, it might be able to do something with us, right? So there's a, it is the farthest thing from a utilitarian view of thought. It even sees the tendency to view thought in those utilitarian terms as part and parcel of the Nietzsche metaphysics he's reacting against, in a way. And not just Nietzschean, but, you know, modern. What practical difference does it make? I think it is fair, we'll get to some of this assessment stuff in the next time. It is fair to say that this moralizing concern is so spiritualist, abstract, academic, ivory towered, highfalutin, that you have to realize, you know, this is someone in the middle of a world war who is objecting to the lack of piety of contemporary mankind, not because of any of the bombings and mass murderings going on, but because people have failed to attend to the still, quiet voice of being, right?
So I have a question. I have two questions.
Sure.
Does the nature of being, capital B, change itself? Is it changed as it reveals itself to man?
So the actual claim is that it's something changing and active. In that sense, yes. It's not just that it's not simply that it is changed by its being understood by man. It is only revealed in its understanding by man. But it has a history. It has an activity. In that it differs from previous understandings of beings. There's the previous schemas would have said being remains always the same and only man's understanding of it changes, right? That's not Heidegger's scheme. In Heidegger's scheme, you know, being is an active term, man responds to the claims of attention that it makes on his thinking, something like that, and that pair has a history. He does not claim that that pair has a history only because of the human side of that pair. If you wanted to find a German idealistic, Fichtian Hegelian formula for what Heidegger means by being, it would be something like the activity of the transcendental, where activity means not only change and having a history, but this sense of actuality, actualization, time and history, right? And of the transcendental, meaning in the sense of something like of the truth itself, right? So there's lots of philosophies that will tell you that if something is changing in time, it doesn't count as the truth itself, or at least there's caricatures of Platonism which will say that. If when Nietzsche is denouncing Platonism, he will say that that's what Plato does. But Heidegger believes that what is true actually changes, right? So in that sense, the activity of the truth is closer to what he means by being than anything else. Now, truth to him, I'm translating truth into other people's philosophies. Truth to him includes this notion of appearing to man, right? So truth has a history of its being understood, not just of the thing understood. But it is not the case that only our understanding of it is changing and the thing itself is not changing. The thing itself is changing. Go ahead, Joe.
I was thinking about the transition that did occur over about a century between the thinking of the universe in the using the Ptolemaic method of concept design or whatever, versus the Galilean one. And then the Galilean one has definitely come to be accepted as much more truthful, I guess, than the Ptolemaic view, even though both were looking at this underlying universe, I suppose. Is that what he means by saying the truth itself changes?
No.
That seemed odd. Yeah.
It's more like Caesar was alive in 44 BC, and Caesar is not alive in 40 BC. The truth has changed.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just events like that he thinks have a history, but it certainly is also events like that. He's all about the ongoing activity in time, eventing, changing world view of things, right? He doesn't think that the reality of the world consists of a mass of mathematical abstractions behind it, right? The phenomenal world is real to Heidegger. It is his brass tacks is to start from the belief that the phenomenal is what you have the most reason for believing is real, whatever else you use to explain that. And nothing you use to explain it will explain it away, right? So time is real. And therefore, what was and what is and what will be are three different things at least, right? So he wants man to be in time, and he's never outside of time. He will go so far as to say that in being in time, he'll give you proofs that a mind that doesn't have time in it is a contradiction in terms. So yeah, he is a phenomenological, particular, historical thinker, and he's an historical thinker because he's a phenomenological thinker, right? He's not someone who thinks that the appearances are illusions, that time is an illusion, that only math is real, anything like that, right? He is the farthest thing from a Spinoza-esque block universe. Good question, Brian. Do you have others?
Reaction to.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, if I may get your reaction. In this reading of this and the other materials, but also in this, it's either, in what's written or my understanding of it. In my reading, I see in some of the ways he writes, there's a distinction between beings as such and then being.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, sense that, and I just want to say this and get your reaction, is that beings as such are infused with being, or that being subsists in all of these beings as such.
Yes. So the way to think about it is metaphysics wants to think about beings as such because it wants to find the things which are invariantly true of all beings, right? So it wants to know propositions which have the form, for every being X, there is blah, 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 right? It wants to find universal truths about beings. And when it tries to reason about beings as such, it's doing so in those terms, and everything it's trying to find is supposed to apply to any given being you might give it, and you can put a for every in front of it, right? But Heidegger's point is, who gives you the actual beings that you do that for every over? So they have to actually exist. And their sense of actually existing is not that they're under that for every sign. They actually exist in actuality, right? And what he says is that the notion of the essence of beings that we get in those for every functions are all trying to be true about all of the individual beings, but they don't tell us anything about the individual beings where they came from, right? They take them as given. What's giving them? Answer, actuality, actual history, actual beings in time, material particulars, individuals, whatever, things actually in time. All these timeless universal truths about that map over every being, right? That are often some mathematical realm of the of logic, right? Those aren't about the actual thing in time. But when metaphysics wants to verify that one of its propositions is true, it will go look at all the actual beings in time. And if any of them stick out and worry them and don't fit into its categories, we'll say, oops, nope, my for every doesn't work because here's one that doesn't fit. Well, what's the one it's looking at? An actual being, right? So it does try to say things about the beings, and when it wants to know whether or not one of those things about the beings is true, it looks at the individual beings, but the individual beings are, because they have being, they are actually actual, right? And the metaphysical way of thinking about them that are supposed to be true of whole classes of them is an abstract machinery about the actuals that's not talking about actuality as such. It's not talking about the fact that they are particular in time, you know, instances, instantiable, whatever. All of those are things which are true of each of the beings. But what Heidegger is saying is, well, what's being itself? Being itself is something like the ongoing event of particulars appearing to minds. That's what's actually happening. And whenever you try to confront actuality, that's what you use as your ground truth. You want to go do an experiment, someone with actual eyes is going to go into an actual lab and they're going to look at actual, instruments, and they record actual positions of actual things on actual screens. And all that actuality is how you're verifying all of your abstract claims. Why? Because you need actuality to the 10th degree in time to verify any statement true about being. You're treating the actuality as your ground truth about being. Okay, how about we look at the actual being that is actual? Right? So he's differentiating between looking at beings as such, as this for every view is trying to, factor out what's common across all beings. That's what metaphysics does, versus looking at actuality as such, of beings actually in time.
Well, okay, I have a follow-up question then. If you're looking at actuality as such, you can look at it, but can you effectively say anything about it?
Sure, say lots of things about it. One is, you can say you can't ever know everything about it. It has a future, which from your point of view is free. Right? There's all kinds of things you can say about actuality, from the fact that, okay, how many actualities are there? One. Right? There's all kinds of things you can say about it, but they're not universal statements that have for everys in front of them, because you don't get 40,000 of them, and you don't get a bunch of them given as separate independent things. You get one. And by the way, you get to see a tiny little piece of it for the little brief span of time that you're alive. Right? You're thrown into a world as a very finite being, right? Et cetera, et cetera. There's all this stuff in being and time, right? But he wants that entirely immersed in the stream of time and becoming and actualization view to inform everything that philosophy tries to claim about its towers of functional abstractions. He is extremely particularist that way, more particularist than Aristotle. Good question. Okay, so I got through the material I wanted to get through, but I want to give people chances to ask further questions about part they didn't understand. And I also, after that, we can foreshadow a little bit of what we're going to talk about next time. But first, if anyone has particular questions about particular parts or things they want to say about, go Joe.
I had mentioned before we started actually that, and it was on page 242.
Okay.
The first full paragraph, it begins by saying the absolute objectification.
Yes.
Okay, those lines were the ones that I actually put a bracket around with a question mark saying, what the hell? So
okay,
can you read that paragraph? You don't need to read it aloud, but that might help.
I got it.
And
so partly he's explaining from the previous paragraph what he's calling the epoch of unconditioned and complete objectification of everything. This is the stuff he talks about in the question concerning technology, but this is and Gestalt and this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, this is his explanation of how the world looks when everybody takes Nietzschean thought to be true, but they're not even, conscious ideological Nietzscheans anymore, right? So they have the instrumental view of power, the ideological view of camps, etc. They're in the middle of the forecast struggle for dominion of the earth as a struggle for power accumulation, and he says at the end of page 241, man himself and every aspect of human culture is transformed into a stockpile, which psychologically reckoned is incorporated into the working process of the will to will, which some may view as free and others will interpret as mechanical, but that's irrelevant, right? So the point is all human processes are viewed as raw material, right? Human beings become human resources, ranked behind natural resources and raw materials, right? The fundamental thing that is going on is all claims of truth and being have been turned into values, and values are being reckoned upon in terms of their ability to govern men's conduct, and the conduct that they're governing is the struggle for dominion of the earth, and the struggle for dominion of the earth is being waged as a struggle between warring camps of power, which is going to be decided by who can accumulate how much power. So power accumulation is determining everything. So what happens then? He says, he says that this is grounded in the unconditioned character of objectification itself, which must bring every stockpile, no matter what its nature, into its own possession and secure this possession. So his point is that it is not only the case that mankind can view everything as raw material for power accumulation, it is that now he does, right? And as a practical matter, he does. And he calls this the absolute objectification. When he says of the being, he means of the world, basically, of every individual being in the world. As such, results from the self-fulfilling dominion of subjectivity. What makes it a self-fulfilling dominion of subjectivity? So what he means by that is mankind viewed everything from the standpoint of the willing subject, and he made the aims of the willing subject the standard of what is. And by the time we got to Nietzsche, that was his will to power determining what is, and the usefulness of things for his will to power determining what is. That's what he's calling the self-fulfilling dominion of subjectivity, right? So when man views all of his concepts by which he understands the world as that his technological means for securing the permanence of this or that structure of domination in the world, that is the self-fulfilling dominion of subjectivity. Self-fulfilling because it projected that this was true, and as soon as it projected that was true, it was true enough for it because it governed its man's acts. It says this occurs essentially as the most extreme release of the being as such, the world, into the omission of being itself. So his point of this is that man is viewing everything as a means to ends, and he's not paying any attention to anything like the claims of being itself. In that way, being refuses its default. Okay, to the extreme. Default, this is that mistranslated word staying away. And as such, refusal dispatches being in the form of beings as such, dispatches it as the destiny of the complete concealment of being in the midst of the thoroughgoing and securing of beings. So what he's saying there is that mankind has completely forgotten about the question of being, or the question of the unveiling of the truth of being, or the truth. And the only thing that he cares about, the only kind of truth claim that he cares about is such technological claims as are operationally useful for securing additional power to control the world, right? Mankind's only standard of truth has become what helps me secure the world. And he's calling all of that, he's portraying all of that as, this is exactly Nietzsche's view of the world transpiring. The world is now behaving as though Nietzsche's philosophy were true. They don't have to be convinced of it. They're acting as though it is true, right? And as a result, none of them are paying attention to any claim of truth that isn't a means of utility for power, right? So that's what that paragraph is trying to say. Sorry, I want to ask Joe.
Up on that.
Hang on, Brian. Before you follow up, I just want to ask Joe if he has questions about what he said, because I have no idea if I was comprehensible.
I can't answer whether you're comprehensible or not until I think about it further.
Fair enough.
But I do appreciate you're making that paragraph much more clear.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to absorb this whole, you know.
The second half of it, where he talks about being refuses its default to the extreme, and as such refusal dispatches being in the form of beings as such, that is incredibly dense, right? The part of it is more, the part of it that is more comprehensible on what we've gotten from volume 3 and volume 4 is the part about the self-fulfilling dominion of subjectivity. You should be able to hear that is, talking about Nietzsche and modern subjectivity itself, culminating in Nietzsche, right? Sorry, Brian. You wanted to react?
Right. If this is I may not use all exactly the right words, but if this is the prevailing truth that you've outlined is this one that's everything's instrumental towards the accumulation of power.
Yes.
Is it Heidegger's view, or is it implicit in his view that truth needs to play itself out like kind of a world play before we move on to the next truth?
He doesn't think that it necessarily has to play itself out. He thinks that noticing that this is happening is essential to it ever ceasing to happen, right? You have to recognize that this is happening, you have to diagnose it to be able to take a step back from it. He refers to what he is doing as trying to take a step back from that after having seen it, right? But the claim is something like accurate diagnosis necessary to react to it, and the reaction to it is not going to take the form of being able to overcome it, because that's just another power accumulation move inside the structure of power accumulation, and it's just going to be part of the same thing. It has to be something more like a stepping back to a standard of truth, which is not simply effectiveness. And that is more like a thoughtful attending to what is. By the end of the page, he's talking about, what is what takes place. What takes place has already taken place. There's a the default of being comes toward the essence of man in such a way that in his relation to being man unwittingly turns away from it. So the point is that something like paying careful attention to what is actually happening with an objective standard of truth is going to be the thing that steps back from simply manipulating everything as a tool for power accumulation. And the there need what's the point? It requires a changed perspective from Nietzsche's philosophy and a stepping back from it to get out of well, not even to get out of, to have any chance of moving on from this kind of nihilism. He doesn't claim that all that is necessary to get out of this kind of nihilism is to be against it, so to speak, right? Sorry, Brian, I realize you're distracted. Hello.
Well, I'm hearing, I don't know what you're saying, but I heard everything you've said. Except
Okay,
you cut out a little.
Sorry, you just froze for a second, that's all. Your screenshot froze. So I wasn't sure if you could hear me. Yeah, so I was just saying that he doesn't think that it is sufficient to get out of this, that you just not like it, right? That's not sufficient to get out of this.
Well, it seems like based on to add maybe to what you've said, stepping back from it would necessarily kind of imply stepping out of it, out of the power struggle.
Yes. Yes. I think that's fair. I think that is what he's talking about.
And is he recommending that for people?
For at least some people, for at least thoughtful people. He talks about besides hearkening to the still voice of being, letting beings be. But there's plenty of further you can reach on that. You can read on that isn't just contained in this essay. Let's put it that way. Okay, have to drop at 4. Okay, 7 minutes. Do you have other questions you want to get to before you have to go?
Me?
Okay, I was talking to Pete. Sorry.
Uh-huh.
I think he's saying no.
Okay. I'm good. No questions.
Okay. Joe, I gave you an analysis of one paragraph. Do you have others that were similarly incomprehensible?
I'm going to leave that specific aside and
okay.
enjoy the overall picture here and
sure.
Make an effort in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks or however you allot to go over here and think in a deeper way. So I'll have more coherence.
So that's a good segue to what I want to do next, because I think we agreed that 2 weeks from now is when we want to do the next one. Is that right?
Works for me.
On the 1st, November 1st. And the idea is we don't have a reading this time. It's just assessing all of volume 3 and 4, right? So it's just reread whatever you want to reread, go over your notes, view some of the things online that we've had in the last few lectures if you want. But we just want to have overall questions and reactions to this whole thing. After that, our next thing is going to be moving on to the Gilson book, Being and Some Philosophers, where we're going to start with chapter 1. But so if you want to, look ahead to getting a book, if you don't already have it, that would be something to work on. But for next time, it's just come up with questions, come up with reactions. We're going to have a general overview of all of this, and I want to put that in a couple categories. One is just things that he said, claims that he made, what we learned from it, about Nietzsche, about Heidegger himself, right? About the history of philosophy, those sorts of things. But then also, things we think about it, ways in which it influenced people later, questions about anything like that. And then also anything that's sort of critical assessments, places where you think, he got something wrong, or he makes a claim that he didn't manage to support, or you weren't convinced by something, but also any places in which how to put it, you see ways in which he's dependent upon his predecessors, or you find strains of what he's thinking in someone else, anything like that. So an example of that latter question is how indebted is Heidegger's own formulation to Nietzsche before him, right? He clearly comes out in a different place, but he's also influenced by him in some important ideas, right? So what's the relationship of directions of influence between Nietzsche and Heidegger? And you could ask that same question with, other thinkers as well. My internet connection is unstable. You probably didn't hear me. Sorry, I just got a notice. But anyway,
I heard it. I got it.
Great. But anyway, things like that are, possible subjects for next time to think about, and we'll just, we might finish a little bit faster, like 2 or 3 hours, because we'll see how long the conversation goes, but we won't have a reading this time. All right, so we'll let Pete go, and Joe and Brian, we can stay for more questions if you have them. See you, Pete.
I always feel a little bit exhausted after 3 hours. Sorry.
It's fine. 3 is plenty.
Not much different. At least when I finished the reading on Thursday, I felt a sense of accomplishment, as I should do. But then I decided to go back and start again at the very beginning. I thought, I got 2 days. Yes. I can read the whole thing again. Didn't last very long.
Yes. Well, I finished rereading it, I think, Friday, maybe Saturday. And then I found myself starting over again like this morning, and I got like, quarter of the way or something. But I can't read 50 pages this dense in a day or two either, is the thing I'm trying to tell you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It seems to me that the more times you've been down the road, the more familiar it looks as you pass it again and again.
Yes.
And I think that that's a worthy way of thinking about this density.
Yes. I mean, this also, because it has so many references out to other thinkers, it helps to just have read a lot of other thinkers. And in this case, also resonances to other things in Heidegger, both things before, like being in time, things after, where he's going. The more surrounding material you have, the easier it is to digest the individual bits. But of course, chicken and egg, you gotta start somewhere.
Well, that's why I'm looking forward also to Gelson, because he'll begin to bring some of this back into perspective, and he'll reach back in time to these other guys.
Yes, I mean, I think Gilson is not nearly as challenging. Some of the ideas are still quite hard, but in terms of the language and how foreign from everyday concerns it is, it's going to be much less challenging than the Heidegger, I think. So some may find it a breath of fresh air.
My only regret about Gelson is that for some reason his publisher set the book at 8-point or 6-point type. And so it's like read it with a magnifying glass. Yeah, it's incredible.
Well, I don't see 8, but it's still pretty small. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I find those things online, I can enlarge them, because the screen lets you at least enlarge. You might have to scroll back and forth, but nevertheless.
Yes.
But when it's in a book, the only thing I can do is hold a magnifying glass up as I read.
Literal. Well, reading glasses are a little magnifying glass. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have reading glasses, but to hold it up like this is much worse than having it down on my lap, which is the difference it makes.
Sure. Okay, Brian, do you have other closing comments or questions?
Well, I really find that, I find this totally interesting, and I'm really enjoying it. But I have I do have an idea why I persist in trying to log on. Sometimes it takes me a half hour or an hour because I'm so interested in this. I've got 4 different Apple appliances here.
Yes.
I've got my desktop, laptop, iPad, and phone. The only one I got to work today was the phone. And this every week it's a different appliance. I can't figure it out. The only guess is that this week the internet was not working so well. I did get a lot of signals that the, Cox cable was unstable. So I think I've been using the cellular now finally, but I want you to know that I am very interested, and I do persist in, in logging on even with these technical problems.
Yep. Thanks for your patience with them. Glad it's worthwhile to get back, and hope you have fewer of them in the future.
I'm trying to figure out what it is, but it just, you don't want to know about all that. I am trying to figure it out.
Sure. All right. Well, good luck with that. And
one final question.
Yes.
One final question. Behind your head, Jason, there is some kind of artistic drawing on the wall.
Yes.
And I've been trying to figure out for several weeks now, several sessions now.
Yes.
Does that say George and the Dragon or something?
No.
Or what is?
It's actually it is card art from the game Magic the Gathering. It was
wonderful.
Drawn by a artist named Greg Staples. It's one of the best artists that ever did card art for them.
Right.
It's called Sarah Angel. But it's just a female angel with a sword, kind of Valkyrie-like figure that was drawn for a game. But I really like it. I think he's a really good artist.
It is very nice. I had a few of those history of science fiction type artists too that I collected, especially when I was younger. But that is very interesting. I can't focus. I'm too far away from it.
So if you just look up on Google or something, Greg Staples, S like the stapler, Greg Staples, and SERRA Angel, you'll find it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, yeah, good question. All right, take care, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.